At 1:47 in the morning, someone walked up to Nancy Guthrie's front door and disabled the camera in seconds. No panic. 41 minutes later, at exactly 2:28 am, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stopped transmitting, and then she vanished. The FBI had surveillance footage. They had blood evidence. They had Dina. They had more than 50,000 tips from the public. They had a Bitcoin ransom wallet connected to threatening messages. They even had a glove recovered near the investigation area that reportedly contained an unknown male NA profile. And still, 95 days later, Nancy Guthrie was gone. That's what makes this case so unsettling. This doesn't feel like a disappearance where investigators had nothing to work with. It feels like a case where something important may have been missed very early. Now Nancy Grace, former prosecutor and one of the most recognized voices in American crime coverage, is publicly questioning part of the investigation itself. Not the evidence, not the victim, the strategy. Because according to Grace, investigators may have narrowed their focus too quickly. One detail keeps coming back up: a glove found outside the main search perimeter, roughly 2 miles away from Nancy's home. And if evidence connected to the suspect existed outside that boundary, then investigators may have been looking in the wrong place from the very beginning. What makes the story even more disturbing is that the suspect did appear random. The movement looked calm, planned, familiar with the neighborhood. Which raises a much bigger question. Do you think this case was random or carefully planned? Because the deeper investigators looked at the evidence, the more it seemed possible they had focused on the wrong area from the very beginning. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. And from the beginning, investigators understood something important about this case that changed everything about how they approached it. Nancy was not someone likely to vanish on her own. She relied on a walker to move around comfortably. She required daily medication. She had a pacemaker helping regulate her heart. Friends described her as mentally sharp, but physically fragile. Even Sheriff Chris Nanos later said it publicly. She couldn't walk 50 yards by herself. That single detail eliminated a lot of the usual possibilities investigators consider in missing person cases. This was not someone expected to wander into the desert in the middle of the night. Not someone physically capable of disappearing for days without assistance. Which meant investigators were likely dealing with something intentional almost immediately. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy spent time with family. She had dinner with her daughter Annie Guthrie and Annie's husband, Thomas O'Chean. By every public account, nothing seemed unusual that night. No argument, no emergency, no indication that this would become the last normal evening before a national investigation. Later that night, Tomaso drove Nancy home. He watched her go inside the house. Then he left. That was the last confirmed sighting. Everything that matters happened after that. Sometime after midnight, the neighborhood grew quiet. Most homes were dark. Traffic had almost disappeared from the streets around Nancy's house. Then, at 1:47 in the morning, someone approached the front door. The surveillance footage would later become one of the most disturbing parts of the investigation, not because it was chaotic, but because it wasn't the individual wore dark clothing and gloves. A backpack could be seen over one shoulder. Investigators later noted how calm the movement appeared. The person walked directly toward the camera and disabled it within seconds. No hesitation, no confusion, no wasted movement. It looked like someone who already knew exactly where the camera was located before arriving. According to later reporting, investigators were able to recover portions of deleted footage through back-end systems connected to the device. And the more people studied the footage, the more one thing became difficult to ignore. This didn't look improvised. At 2:12 am, motion was reportedly detected again near the property. Then came the timestamp investigators still focus on today. 2:28 am. That was the moment Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker missed its scheduled transmission. For investigators, the timing mattered enormously. Nancy depended on that device. The sudden interruption created one of the clearest anchors in the entire timeline. After that point, there were no confirmed signs of her again. And as disturbing as the footage already was, investigators reportedly became even more concerned after reviewing earlier activity around the house. Because the suspect may not have arrived there randomly that night. According to publicly discussed details surrounding the case, someone believed to match the suspect's appearance may have been seen near the property weeks earlier. One reported appearance happened on January 11th, then another later in January. At first, those sightings did not necessarily look important. A person near a neighborhood camera rarely stands out on its own, but after Nancy disappeared, investigators began looking at those earlier appearances differently. Not as coincidence, as preparation. Nancy Grace later described the pattern almost like escalation. First observing, then rehearsing, then acting. And once that idea enters the story, the emotional tone changes completely. Because now the suspect no longer looks impulsive. He looks patient. The glove suggests planning. The backpack suggests preparation. The calm movement suggests familiarity with the property and surrounding area. Even the timing feels deliberate. This wasn't someone stumbling into the wrong house in panic or confusion. It looked more like someone who had already studied the environment beforehand, someone comfortable enough to move through darkness without rushing. And that's where Nancy Grace believes the FBI made its first major mistake. In investigations like this, one of the first things law enforcement does is create a search perimeter. Most people never really think about what that means. They imagine police tape, patrol cars, maybe helicopters circling overhead. But a perimeter is actually something much more important than that. It's a decision. Investigators define a geographic radius around the crime scene, and once they do, resources naturally begin flowing inward. Cameras inside the area get checked first. Witnesses inside the area get prioritized first. Tips connected to streets outside that boundary can slowly lose urgency, without anyone intentionally ignoring them. And according to Nancy Grace, that may be exactly what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case. Her criticism wasn't that investigators didn't work hard. By every public measure, they did. The FBI devoted major resources to the case almost immediately. Local authorities coordinated extensive searches. Thousands of tips flooded in from across the country. But Nancy Grace repeatedly argued that investigators may have narrowed their focus too tight too soon. In her view, the problem wasn't the effort, it was direction. Because one detail kept bothering people following the investigation closely. Evidence connected to the suspect may have existed outside the main search area, almost from the beginning. Roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators reportedly recovered a glove near a roadside field area connected to the broader investigation. According to reporting surrounding the case, the glove appeared visually consistent with the gloves worn by the individual captured on surveillance footage outside Nancy's house. But the most important detail wasn't where the glove was found. It was what investigators reportedly found on it. Dena, an unknown male profile, not Nancy Guthrie, not publicly identified, not immediately connected to known close contacts. That image stayed with a lot of people following the case. A single glove lying near the edge of the investigation zone, sitting in dry roadside grass, just outside the area where attention had concentrated most heavily. And Nancy Grace's question was simple. If the glove was outside the circle, what else was? Because once investigators began looking beyond the immediate area surrounding Nancy's home, other details reportedly started surfacing too. One of them involved a possible vehicle captured on a nearby Ring camera system during the early morning hours after Nancy disappeared. Public discussion around the case suggested the footage may have shown a suspicious car moving through the area during the same time frame investigators were already focused on. But according to some commentary surrounding the investigation, that lead may not have received immediate priority early on. And whether that's fully accurate or not, the possibility frustrated many people following the case because the timeline already appeared so precise. A suspect approaches the house, the camera gets disabled, Nancy's pacemaker stops transmitting, then a vehicle may have been seen moving nearby afterward. To many observers, those details felt connected. And then the story became even more complicated when Nancy's daughter, Annie Guthrie, reportedly began trying to map out what she believed could have been the suspect's escape route from the neighborhood. Not publicly at first, privately. According to reporting discussed around the case, Annie shared a possible route with neighbors and asked residents to review surveillance footage from homes and businesses along the area. Doorbell cameras, parking lot cameras, traffic-facing systems. Anything that might help reconstruct movement away from Nancy's house after the disappearance. That detail caught the attention of former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendefer, who later commented publicly that Annie's proposed route deserved serious consideration. And suddenly, investigators and commentators alike were looking at the neighborhood differently, not just as a crime scene, as a surveillance map, because modern suburban streets are covered in cameras almost constantly now. Doorbells, schools, intersections, parking lots, businesses. Even small side streets often overlap with multiple recording angles people barely notice in daily life. Nancy Grace later pointed to examples reportedly located along the possible route. a nail salon with cameras facing the street, a nearby school with overlapping corner surveillance, businesses covering intersections where vehicles would likely pass while leaving the area, which created one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire investigation. If that route contained so many cameras, why is there still no publicly known clear image of the suspect vehicle? There are really only two explanations. The first is that investigators already possess stronger footage and are intentionally withholding it to protect the investigation. That happens more often than people realize. Law enforcement sometimes keeps critical details private so future suspects can adjust their stories around public information. But the second possibility is the one Nancy Grace kept returning to. The suspect may have already known where the cameras were. And once you consider that possibility, the entire case starts feeling different. The calm movement toward the front door feels different. The quick disabling of the camera feels different. The route through the neighborhood feels different. It stops looking random. It starts looking rehearsed, like someone had already studied the streets beforehand. Maybe more than once. And if the suspect knew where cameras were, who taught him the neighborhood? By this point, the investigation had already become national news. Surveillance footage had been released. The timeline was everywhere online. Nancy Grace was discussing the case publicly. And as happens in almost every major missing person investigation now, internet attention began turning the people closest to the victim. Especially one person, Tommaso Cian. He was the last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. He had driven her home after dinner. He watched her enter the house, then left. Before this case, Tommaso lived a relatively private life. Friends described him as quiet and reserved, someone far removed from public controversy. Then overnight, strangers online started analyzing everything connected to him. His interviews, his expressions, his timeline, his background. That kind of pressure escalates quickly online because people naturally search for emotional certainty during unresolved cases. And in internet true crime culture, proximity often becomes suspicion almost immediately. The last person to see someone alive becomes the center of discussion, whether evidence supports it or not. Forums filled with theories. Social media clips dissected tiny details. Some people claimed investigators were protecting the family because of Savannah Guthrie's public profile. Others treated ordinary behavior as hidden meaning. But there's an important detail that often got lost once speculation took over. Investigators publicly addressed the family early in the case. Sheriff Chris Nanos later stated that the Guthrie family, including siblings and spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. And in modern investigations, that process is extensive. Investigators examine phone records, location data, digital timelines, surveillance overlap, financial activity, and movement patterns. Major inconsistencies are extremely difficult to hide for long. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendiffer later called accusations against Tommaso absurd, arguing that modern forensic timelines make it very difficult for close family members to secretly manipulate events without leaving contradictions investigators would eventually uncover. And whether viewers personally agree or disagree with that assessment, one thing matters here more than anything else. Knowledge is not guilt. Access is not involvement. That distinction is critical because Nancy Grace's argument was often misunderstood online. She wasn't talking about guilt. She was talking about access. Because whoever approached Nancy Guthrie's home appeared unusually informed. The movement toward the camera looked confident. The timing looked deliberate. The suspect appeared familiar with the property and surrounding streets. And naturally, the people closest to Nancy knew details about her life too. Her routine, her sleep schedule, which entrance she typically used, the layout of the house, the fact that she lived alone, the timing of dinner that night. Again, none of this means the family helped commit a crime. There is no public evidence supporting that claim. But investigators in cases like this still ask another uncomfortable question. How does private information become public information? Sometimes through direct surveillance, sometimes through repeated observation, and sometimes through ordinary conversation people never imagined could matter later. A contractor entering the home weeks earlier. A casual conversation overheard in public. A neighbor mentioning routines. A social media post revealing plans unintentionally. Information moves quietly. That's part of what makes this case psychologically unsettling. The suspect's behavior did not feel chaotic. It felt patient. The earlier appearances near the property, the timing after dinner, the apparent awareness of camera placement, the calm movement toward the front door, even the possible route through the neighborhood. Together, Those details suggest someone who may have understood more about Nancy Guthrie's environment than investigators initially realized. Not necessarily through direct involvement from the family, but possibly through exposure to information surrounding her life. And once viewers begin thinking about the case that way, the emotional tension changes completely. Because now the investigation no longer feels focused only on a stranger entering a house. It feels focused on how ordinary details move through ordinary communities without anyone noticing. A routine repeated long enough to become predictable. A quiet neighborhood observed over time. A vulnerable person whose schedule may have become visible to someone patient enough to study it. And that possibility is exactly why this section of the case became so emotionally charged online. People weren't only reacting to the disappearance itself anymore. They were reacting to the idea that someone may have slowly learned the environment beforehand without raising alarm. What shocks you more, the planning, or how much the suspect seemed to know? But the most important mystery in the case wasn't the family anymore. It was the Dina. As investigators continued reviewing surveillance footage and witness timelines, another part of the case quietly became more important than most people realized: the forensic evidence. Because sometime during the investigation, a hair sample recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home was reportedly sent for analysis. At first, the sample went to a private forensic laboratory before later being transferred to the FFB laboratory at Quantico. That timeline became a major point of discussion surrounding the case. Not because anyone claimed the private lab was unreliable. Modern forensic labs handle sensitive evidence constantly. But in a case this visible involving a possible abduction, federal investigators and national attention people immediately began asking the same question. Why did it take so long to reach Quantico? Nancy Grace repeatedly came back to one phrase when discussing that delay: weeks matter. And in cases involving vulnerable missing persons, they absolutely do. But what made the DNI evidence so complicated was not only the delay. It was the type of sample investigators were reportedly dealing with: a den mixture. Television has conditioned people to think forensic testing works like instant identification. A strand of hair goes into a machine, a suspect's face appears, and the mystery is solved before the next commercial break. Real forensic analysis is much slower than that, especially when multiple DNA profiles overlap. The easiest way to understand a DNA mixture is to imagine several voices speaking at the same time in a dark room. Investigators are trying to separate one specific voice from all the others without confusing who said what. That process can take time, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. And according to reporting surrounding the case, investigators eventually reached a critical conclusion about the profile recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. It reportedly did not belong to Nancy. It also reportedly did not match close contacts already examined during the investigation, which meant investigators were left facing one of the biggest unanswered questions in the entire case. So whose now was inside the house? Because if the unidentified profile belonged to the suspect, then somewhere out there existed a person physically connected to the scene in a measurable, scientific way. Not speculation, not internet theory, evidence. And while forensic investigators worked through that evidence, another trail was developing at the exact same time, one moving through digital systems instead of physical ones: the Bitcoin wallet. Not long after Nancy disappeared, ransom communications reportedly began appearing demanding cryptocurrency payments. A wallet address was included. The demands reportedly reached millions of dollars. The FBI refused to send payment. That decision confused some people watching the case unfold online. If there was even a small chance Nancy was alive, why not engage immediately? But investigators usually approach ransom demands carefully for several reasons. First, many ransom communications turn out to be fake. Public cases attract opportunists hoping to exploit fear and confusion. Second, direct payment can complicate investigations or encourage future extortion attempts. And third, this became Nancy Grace's biggest point: Bitcoin is not invisible. A lot of criminals still misunderstand how cryptocurrency actually works. Bitcoin transactions may appear anonymous at first, but they are permanently recorded on a public blockchain ledger. That means every transfer creates a trail. Every wallet interaction leaves structure behind. And unlike cash, those records do not disappear over time. Investigators now use blockchain analysis in ransomware investigations, dark web cases, cybercrime operations, and international fraud investigations. Entire forensic teams specialize in tracing cryptocurrency movement between wallets and exchanges. Not because Bitcoin hides movement, because it preserves movement. And then came one of the strangest reported developments in the entire case. According to public discussions surrounding the investigation, a small Bitcoin transaction reportedly appeared connected to the ransom wallet on February 10th alongside a message. "We are ready to talk." That detail mattered for one reason above all others. Someone moved first. Whether it was the actual offender, someone connected to them, or someone attempting to manipulate the investigation publicly remains unclear. But the moment activity appeared on that wallet, investigators suddenly had something valuable: movement. Because inactive wallets reveal almost nothing, active wallets create patterns, and patterns are what investigators follow. Especially in modern digital investigations, where even small mistakes can eventually expose much larger networks of activity. And when you step back from all the individual details in the Nancy Guthrie case, something larger begins to emerge. The surveillance footage, the repeated appearances near the property, the calm movement toward the front door, the apparent awareness of camera locations, the possible route through the neighborhood, the unidentified dam, the Bitcoin ransom communication. Individually, each detail raises questions. Together, they suggest something more deliberate. This case looks less like chaos and more like preparation. Not necessarily the kind of preparation people see in movies. Real investigations are usually quieter than that, more ordinary, more procedural. But the suspect's behavior consistently appears patient rather than impulsive, studied rather than random. And that brings the story back to the point Nancy Grace has tried to clarify repeatedly. She is not accusing the family of committing the crime. She is questioning assumptions about how information may have traveled before it happened. Because someone appeared to understand Nancy Guthrie's routine unusually well. The timing, the house, the neighborhood, the camera placement. And sometimes the most dangerous information isn't stolen. It's casually overheard. As of this recording, 95 days have passed since Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson. 95 days without answers. 95 days without medication. And despite the surveillance footage, the DNA evidence, the ransom messages, and thousands of public tips, the case still remains unresolved. The house is still there. The neighborhood is still quiet. And somewhere inside all of the evidence investigators have collected, there is still a missing piece nobody has fully connected yet. The FBI has publicly stated the investigation remains active. The DNA evidence continues to be processed through federal forensic resources at Quantico. Investigators specializing in blockchain analysis are still reviewing activity connected to the Bitcoin wallet. New tips continue to come in. This is not considered a cold case. But active investigations can still feel painfully silent from the outside, especially for families waiting for answers. Especially when every passing week changes the emotional weight of the story a little more. And maybe that's the image that stays with people after everything else fades. Not the headlines, not the internet theories. Just a quiet street in Tucson before sunrise. A disconnected doorbell camera hanging beside the front entrance. And inside the house, a walker still sitting near the doorway where Nancy Guthrie was last known to be safe. If you hope Nancy Guthrie is found, leave a comment so this story keeps reaching people. Somewhere in this case, one detail still doesn't fit, and usually that's where the truth waits.